Hey everybody. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that protests against Trump have been happening all over the country since his election in 2016. To hear the mainstream media narrative, you'd think these protests were organic. They're not. From what I've uncovered, it appears that communist Antifa members have infiltrated student groups and a diverse array of organizations and then co-opted them to promote communism and the overthrow of the United States. With that in mind, let's get started with the Daily Caller. Now, the Daily Caller on the 18th of December published the article revealed Antifa leader relied on anonymity to push radical violent communist agenda. Let's check out the highlights of this article. First, I want to read this editor's note. The subject of this story is being identified because he's pushed radical rhetoric and has advocated for politically motivated violence from behind a mask, okay? This is terrorism. Politically motivated violence is terrorism. Just call it what it is. It's terrorism. The Daily Caller News Foundation does not and will not publish truly private information such as home addresses. The Daily Caller News Foundation has determined that an influential Antifa leader uses aliases to spread radical and often violent rhetoric while concealing his true identity. Joseph Jose Alcoff works with congressional Democrats as part of his day job as a manager with a DC-based advocacy group, but he spreads socialist and communist propaganda when going by the name of Jose Martin. Identifying as Chepe, Alcoff advocates for the violent overthrow of the government and for the murder of the rich. He has relished the mainstreaming of Antifa's militant tactics in the Trump era. Okay? These are crimes. These are federal crimes. This amounts to treason, and it's also, I believe, a violation of the Patriot Act, which I believe they call it the USA Freedom Act or something right now. I don't remember. A 2017 book identified Chepe as an organizer behind the Smash Racism DC, the Antifa group that mobbed Fox News host Tucker Carlson's home in November and ran Ted Cruz out of a restaurant in September. Smash Racism DC organizer Jose Martin, also known as Chepe, is a radical communist and an Antifa leader operating in the United States. He advocates for the violent overthrow of the government and for the murder of the rich and claims to have an international involvement in left-wing movements. Alcoff, who's been involved in radical movements for decades, seeks to create a world that is without capitalism, without private property, that is socialist and communist, he's said as Chepe. He's been an organizer for left-wing movements such as Occupy Wall Street, has close ties with left-wing legal groups such as the National Lawyers Guild, has conducted legal trainings for protesters as a member of Copwatch, and has frequently appeared on mainstream and far-left media to discuss his radical vision for society. Meanwhile, in his professional capacity as Alcoff, he's been quoted in the press from the Democratic Senators Dianne Feinstein of California and Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, and appeared at an event with Democratic Rep. Don Boyer of Virginia outside the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in March, and has been pictured alongside Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown and California Democratic Rep. Maxine Waters. We have got to dispense with nonviolence, he said as Chepe on Radio Dispatch in December 2016. You have to expose them, and you have to expose where they live, their names, and what they do for a living. In other words, this asshole promotes doxing. Alcoff has been arrested at least twice in connection with his radical brand of activism. He was arrested in New York City in 2004 during demonstrations outside the Republican National Convention, and then as a member of the Anti-Racist Action, Alcoff was arrested and charged with rioting in New Jersey. Alcoff typically uses his Jose Martin persona for appearances in mainstream media. Under this alias, he's been cited as a Chicago Copwatch organizer and as an Occupy Wall Street organizer, as well as an unofficial organizer for Bernie Sanders during the 2016 Democratic presidential primary. Jose Martin is often introduced to audiences as an organizer, activist, or militant researcher, and has published articles with Rolling Stone and The Independent, and regularly appears on the BBC radio programs. He discussed his vision of a police-free society on MSNBC in 2015. Through his Twitter account, which he's managed to keep anonymous, Alcoff has said that Antifa organizations need to operate both an above-board group and a below one. Operating groups within the bounds of the laws is necessary to get press and to have a base of support, while underground groups are necessary so activists can't be linked by prosecutors or press, he wrote. Now, this is extremely important because this is entryism, and this is something we're going to be talking a lot about later, because this is happening a lot, and really, this is the subject of this video. Let's move on. His tweets also glorify the killing of his political opponents. When speaking about Trump, he stated, "I hope he has a very public death at the hands of the pitchfork-wielding exploited, a public execution that befits Trump's stature." Alcoff through Twitter frequently calls for the complete dismantlement of America's system of government. Again, this is terrorism. Alcoff, whose job puts him alongside lawmakers, tweeted in September that most members of Congress are imbeciles and later said that it wouldn't be hard to push an anti-imperialist, anti-militarist line on incoming left and center-left members. In other words, they're working to manipulate all new members of Congress. And we've actually seen this on the left already. We just didn't know really where it was coming from. It's like, Jesus, why is there this wave of these idiots talking about things that are so anti-American? One tweet suggested that Alcoff's DC colleagues aren't aware of his radicalism. Again, this is entryism. This is something that we're going to be talking about. And really, it's the main theme of this video. Let's move on to the next article. This article was published yesterday by the Daily Caller. Progressive nonprofit caught trying to conceal references to its employee, unmasked Antifa leader Joseph Jose Alcoff. The progressive nonprofit organization that employs Antifa leader Joseph Jose Alcoff, who has advocated for the violent overthrow of the government, in other words, terrorism, obscured references to the radical communists in its past press releases after Alcoff's extreme ideology was exposed. Now, this organization that he works for is the Americans for Financial Reform, or the AFR. AFR did not respond to multiple requests for comment asking if it was aware of Alcoff's extreme and violent rhetoric or if it planned on taking any action in regards to the radical statements. Instead, the progressive nonprofit obscured references to Alcoff on its website after the DCNF exposed Alcoff's radical personas. AFR modified references to Jose Alcoff in at least 7 past press releases to Jose A sometime before noon, local time Wednesday. And here's an example of that. They have Jose a payday manager. All right. So what are the takeaways? Well, first, this communist Antifa member and possibly others have infiltrated Americans for Financial Reform. Now, once these groups are infiltrated, they use these groups to advocate for communism, both legally and illegally. So during their day job, they advocate peacefully, but then when they put their Antifa masks on, they commit terrorism. So how do communists subvert groups to their ideology? Well, they actually use an almost century-old tactic called entryism. Now, entryism is a political strategy in which an organization or state encourages its members or supporters to join another, usually larger organization in an attempt to expand influence and expand their ideas and program. In situations where the organization being entered is hostile to entryism, the interests may engage in a degree of subterfuge and subversion to hide the fact that they are an organization in their own right. The French turn refers to the classic form of entryism advocated by Leon Trotsky. By the way, he was a communist. In his essays on the French turn. In 1934, he proposed that the French Trotskyists dissolve their communist league to join the French section of the Workers' International, and that it also dissolve its youth section to join more easily with revolutionary elements. The tactic was adopted in August 1934 despite some opposition. The turn successfully raised the group's membership to 300 activists. Proponents of the tactic advocated that the Trotskyists should enter the social democratic parties to connect with revolutionary socialist currents within them and to steer those currents toward Leninism. Think about that, okay? Entryism. So that leads us to Yuri Bezmenov. He's a former Soviet KGB agent and defector to the West during the Cold War. He stated, "The highest art of warfare is to not fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent he does not perceive you as an enemy. You can take your enemy without a single shot being fired." In the mid-1980s, Bezmenov gave an interview where he discussed many aspects of his experience in the KGB and his communist propaganda experience. Let's listen to a clip of that interview.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets use the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage, intelligence gathering, looks more romantic. it sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process, which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Okay, think about that for a moment. They subvert reality to such a degree that they are effectively unable to defend themselves, their family, their communities, and their country. So the takeaway is that ideological subversion or psychological warfare changes the perception of reality to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Okay? This KGB agent told us this in 1984. That was over 30 years ago. Now, I want you to think about that, and let's discuss the American Medical Students Association. Now, this organization has been around for about 50 years, and one of their standing committees is the Race, Ethnicity, and Culture in Health Action Committee. The Race, Ethnicity, and Culture in Health Committee aims to reduce health disparities between different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups through advocacy, education, and service. Our goals include strengthening cultural competency, promoting diversity, empowering future physicians to actively engage in political and social movement towards health equality. That just sounds like a fancy term for we're training you to protest and we are indoctrinating you in communist social justice bigotry. Now, here's the important takeaway about this, and this is something that you really should pay attention to. Get involved. If you want to get involved with this committee, you can go to the January Health Equity Week of Action. Interested in learning more about and impacting the root and upstream causes of health disparities and inequalities? HEWA sheds light on and provides ways for chapters to get involved in a national action week on issues important to addressing health inequalities in our communities. So they want to create this January Health Equity Week of Action. They want this to be a nationwide thing. All right. So let's click on that. And when we do, we get to HEWA, Health Equity Week of Action, from January 20th to the 25th, 2019 is the next one. The Health Equity Week of Action is an annual week-long event that focuses on raising awareness about both the health disparities that exist across racial, ethnic, cultural, and social groups. HEWA utilizes a variety of interactive and innovative events to inform and inspire the actions needed to eradicate such health inequalities. I want you to think about that for a moment, okay? That right there is template social justice bullshit speak. This is the language that Antifa uses all the time, all right? Now, this organization has been around for about 50 years, so I'm sure they weren't always communist, but it's very clear that they're pushing communist propaganda now. And even more so, they're grooming activists. This is their activist toolbox, okay? All the links for this will be in the description. Now, what's interesting about this, if you scroll down to the very bottom, I mean, there's a lot of information here. You scroll down to the very bottom, they have an activist book list. Again, Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals by his disciple, Ed Chambers. So with that in mind, what surprised me is this. If you look at the Health Equity Week of Action, January 20th, something stands out about that date, January 20th. And then I did some more research and I realized January 20th was President Trump's inauguration day in 2017. You know what else is significant about this date? Since Trump was inaugurated in 2017, Antifa riots on this day. So of course, Antifa has a week of action planned for around January 20th, 2019. And they're working with a lot of organizations to do this. This is even on the BAM website as well. It's going down. All right. So it appears that the American Medical Students Association has been infiltrated and co-opted by communist Antifa operators using the old school entryist tactics developed by Trotsky back in the 1930s. Now, my guess is that the donors to United for Equity and Affirmative Action Legal Defense Fund, that BAM affiliate, my guess is that all these groups have been infiltrated by Antifa and have been subverted to push communism. And take a look, okay? There is the Society for American Law Teachers, so in other words, attorneys. There's all these unions. The Center for Constitutional Rights, which is filing lawsuits against the United States. The Ford Foundation. These are some heavy hitters. So with that in mind, let's look at the call for a week of action around January 20th, 2019 from Antifa. By the way, this was published back in November of this year. Nobody's reported on this yet. Okay. Along with our comrades from It's Going Down, in other words, BAM, Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, and The Final Straw, we are calling for a week of action around the weekend of January 20th, 2019. With the charges from the January 20th, 2017 dropped, in other words, their initial riots, we can focus on other forms of long-term solidarity and mutual aid, creating fertile soil for a future resistance and creativity. 2 years ago, anarchists took to the streets to open Trump's presidency with a powerful act of defiance. January 20th, 2017 was supposed to represent a dawn of a new authoritarian nationalism. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new era of resistance. The actions around the U.S. on January 20th helped catalyze a wave of direct action that prevented Trump from immediately implementing his agenda. A year later, in response to the ensuing repression, we called for a nationwide day of solidarity on January 20th, 2018 to support those facing charges and to expand our capacity in the face of escalating far-right violence. Now, with the January 20th charges dropped, we can focus on building capacity for the future. We'd like to see a nationwide week of action around January 20th, 2019 to show that attempts to crush us only make us stronger. When BAM talks about this, they actually state, last year, It's Going Down, along with Crime Think and many others, called for a week of action in solidarity with January 20th defendants, and moreover, for the revolutionary autonomous movement to discuss the path ahead. The response to the call was phenomenal, with people organizing everything from conferences to block parties to film showings and benefit events. Okay, so in other words, this Antifa call for rioting wasn't just about rioting. They wanted everybody to have events on and around January 20th. Because again, if you have events everywhere in the country, right? So you've got conferences, you've got block parties, you've got film showings, and all these benefit events. Guess what? The police are going to be busy dealing with them, and they're not going to have the resources to go after Antifa communist rioters. I want you to think about that for a moment. This was top-down plan. This is like some supervillain shit, okay? This is also not a call to stop fighting and instead build. Our ability to resist is made possible by our degree of autonomy and infrastructure, and vice versa. We ask, what would it mean to attack the legitimacy of the state and capital by meeting our own ends directly and on our own terms? In other words, they want to rebuild, they want to resupply so that they can take over the government. Okay, this is terrorism. This is terrorism, and they are calling for revolution. And you read this in the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto actually discusses revolution. You listen to the Socialist Democrats, you listen to all these other groups out there, they are all calling for revolution. They even say it. Like, if you listen to them enough and you record their speeches, you can go back and watch their speeches on YouTube and other platforms. They're calling for revolution. They don't give a shit about the vote. They want everybody to commit to revolution. And we even saw that with the immigration rush of the border right after Thanksgiving. You see, Antifa was a part of that. Antifa was pushing these illegal immigrants to rush the border. And then they used it as a photo op opportunity to try to go, look, these innocent women and children are getting assaulted, when Antifa created the problem in the first place. I want you to think about that. I actually discussed this in prior videos. But again, this is terrorism. They are trying to shift public opinion using terroristic tactics. And then after the tactics are there, then they take off their masks, they get back on television, they start reporting the news, and they give interviews, and they're like, look at these poor people. And they never talk about the fact that they were actually involved in creating the incident in the first place. So not only are they dishonest, but they are working both sides of the narrative. They create the incident, they create the riot, and then after the riot is over, they go on TV, they write articles, they speak to college students as their instructors, as teachers, as journalists, as experts, and they say, oh my gosh, this is injustice, and they start wagging the dog. Now, this is the important piece of this article from BAM, the Antifa terrorist organization. Across our territories and the wide variety of organizations, spaces, crews, affinities, networks, and unions that compromise our movement, many of us are already doing this work, from autonomous disaster relief to community food distros, warm winter survival programs, healthcare, and reproductive resilience. Let's stop there. These are all groups that Antifa has infiltrated. Healthcare and reproductive resilience. Sounds a whole lot like the American Medical Student Association, doesn't it? Self-defense and firearms training class, and also mobilizing supplies to send to the border in anti-pipeline and land defense struggles. Again, these people are human traffickers. They are supporting human traffickers to get illegal immigrants into the country because they want to recruit them as fighters. That's why when you see these illegal immigrants, not just in the United States, but in Europe, pushing through the borders, the majority of them are men of fighting age. You give them food, you give them water, you give them shelter, you give them money, and they'll do whatever you want them to do because these people are desperate. And they have been put in desperate situations because of Antifa. We saw in Honduras, even Vice President Pence has said, in Honduras, these leftist organizations were taking out newspaper ads. They were advertising on Facebook, and they're saying, get in the United States free, everything will be great. Then they put them on charter buses, and they drove them from Honduras to the southern border. And then when they got there, and there was this huge fight there, that broke these people. That broke these innocent victims of Antifa and these other human traffickers. So then, of course, they were ripe to be manipulated to riot and to push toward the border because they believe these people and they were lied to. And that's the thing, is not only is Antifa and these communist infiltrators, not only are they committing crimes themselves, but they are creating victims everywhere they go. And the thing that's important about that is that a lot of innocent people are going to die. My guess is that the American Medical Students Association is a great organization. My guess is that they've been doing good work for 50 years of their life. And Antifa has infiltrated them. And there's going to be many of these people who have no idea about Antifa's attempts to overthrow our government and to institute communism. And they're going to get hurt as a result. My guess is that all the Antifa donors that I outlined in my prior videos have been infiltrated by communist Antifa members as well. Now, while I can't say with absolute certainty which groups Antifa has infiltrated, I do know one thing for sure. Antifa will be staging massive nationwide riots in a month from now, around January 20th, 2019. In order to hold and identify these terrorists accountable for their actions, law enforcement and investigative journalists need to record which groups hold protest and activist activities around this date, then identify and investigate everybody who shows up. And with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with something to think about. If American law enforcement doesn't start investigating and charging Antifa members with terrorism soon, Antifa communists will start a civil war, which was their goal all along. I'm DDJ, and this has been your dose of misandry today.